In the face of ever-changing naval warfare, it's common for specific pieces of technology to become outdated in the blink of an eye. Such is the case with the Devonport Naval Base's submarine graveyard.
Hidden beneath the waves near a remote Russian port lies an eerie graveyard of rusting nuclear submarines. Once symbols of Cold War power, now silent threats corroding in the deep. What were once triumphs of engineering have become ticking time bombs, leaking secrets, and possibly radiation, into the sea. This underwater grave wasn't meant to be forgotten, yet it hides dangers far greater than anyone imagined. What experts recently uncovered here has stunned the world. What looks like decaying scrap metal may be one of the most dangerous nuclear sites on Earth, its true peril only now emerging. Forgotten Nuclear Submarine Cemetery. Near the Russian port of Vladivostok lies an eerie and mostly overlooked site where dozens of Soviet nuclear submarines were dragged into a shallow bay and abandoned. From the surface, the sprawling cluster of rusted hulls looks nothing more than a scrap yard. But beneath the rust and corrosion, these ghost ships hide secrets that could spell danger. These submarines, many stripped of parts but left with nuclear reactor compartments intact, have become a ticking time bomb. The question is, what really happens when such powerful machines are simply left to decay in salty water? Most assumed these submarines were safely dismantled, thoroughly defueled, and neutralized before being towed here. Yet recent investigations using advanced scanning technologies have revealed this is dangerously far from the truth. Not all these submarines were properly disarmed, and some still contain spent nuclear fuel. With decades of neglect, salt water has begun to eat through the steel hulls, increasing the risk of leaks. This unsettling discovery has turned a forgotten naval junkyard into one of the world's most hazardous, yet largely unknown, radioactive sites. Why were these submarines abandoned here in the first place? Vladivostok was a vital base for the Soviet Pacific Fleet during the Cold War, and the bay served as a convenient place to moor retired vessels temporarily. But temporary became permanent. The sheer number of submarines retiring far outpaced the Soviet Union's capacity to dismantle them safely. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, Russia's resources and infrastructure collapsed too, meaning these vessels were left to rot as the economy spiraled downward. The temporary submarine cemetery became a grim testament to this failure. What's chilling is just how close this graveyard is to a major city, with marine traffic, fishing, and local communities nearby. Radiation experts warn that leaks from these rusting submarines could enter the marine ecosystem, affecting wildlife and people alike. For years, environmental observers and whistleblowers flagged the site, but limited transparency and secrecy kept the true scale hidden. Now, with modern surveying techniques, the most dangerous parts of this nuclear scrapyard have been mapped out, revealing a hazard that simply cannot be ignored. It's difficult to overstate how unusual it is to have so many nuclear reactors deteriorating in open water. Typically, spent reactors are removed and stored under strict security on land. But here, the failing metal hulls housing these reactors rest in shallow seawater, exposed to storms and corrosion with no effective containment. This vulnerability transforms what was once a powerful Navy asset into a slow-moving nuclear threat. The potential consequences of a large radioactive leak from this site are deeply unsettling. Those who understand nuclear technology stress that rust and corrosion, combined with leftover radioactive materials, create a uniquely dangerous combination. The aging metal wears thin as radioactive elements slowly seep from damaged fuel rods and reactor compartments. The possibility of contamination increases every year that these submarines remain here unfinished, a quiet and invisible threat. The graveyard has become a time bomb underwater, quietly deteriorating in ways no one wants to talk about. Local retired naval engineers describe the site as a living hazard, a place where the forgotten nuclear hearts are still beating inside steel carcasses. This is not a story about old rusty boats. It's a story about radioactive reactors left to decay. The longer these submarines stay here untouched, the greater the risk that radioactive material will leak into the surrounding environment. possibly affecting fish stocks and the livelihoods of local people. The problem is enormous, complex, and looming large just beneath the waves. The discovery of this abandoned nuclear submarine cemetery has forced experts around the world to rethink what happens when massive government programs collapse without safe nuclear disposal measures. It is a brutal lesson in neglected nuclear responsibility, with threats that reach far beyond borders. But what led to this crisis, and why was it allowed to happen? The answers lie in the rise, peak, and fall of the Soviet nuclear submarine fleet, a story tightly bound to the Cold War itself. The decay of these metal giants is just the surface of a deeper, more troubling legacy. What's hidden inside these submarines will soon become clear. But first, we have to understand the sheer scale of the Soviet nuclear fleet and the urgent pressures that shaped its existence. The massive fleet that once ruled the seas was built in an era where power meant everything, and safety often came second. The Soviet nuclear fleet, in context. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union launched an unprecedented naval arms race that changed the balance of global power. Nuclear-powered missile submarines were the crown jewel of this strategy. These underwater behemoths were designed to deliver a terrifying nuclear threat deep into enemy territory, lurking silently beneath the waves. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Navy had assembled hundreds of these submarines, a fleet so vast no other country could match it. The Soviet shipyards worked at breakneck speed, forging these subs from the frozen waters of the Kola Peninsula all the way to the far eastern ports of Vladivostok. They produced ballistic missile subs armed with multiple thermonuclear weapons, deadly attack subs designed to hunt enemy vessels, and multi-purpose types that could handle a range of missions. Among these, the Typhoon class stood out as the largest submarines ever constructed, stretching over 570 feet, more than 1.5 football fields in length. Each Typhoon-class submarine could carry 20 nuclear missiles, each with a payload many times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This staggering capability made them a centerpiece of Soviet deterrence, projecting a constant threat to rival Western powers. Maintaining such a fleet was an enormous drain on resources, involving constant patrols, intense crew training, and extensive repairs. But building these vessels was just the beginning. Eventually, the regime faced the equally daunting task of retiring them safely. During this Cold War buildup, speed was paramount, often trumping safety and long-term planning. The Soviet Naval Command prioritized quantity and rapid deployment, creating a large fleet faster than infrastructure could support its upkeep, let alone its decommissioning. The state had protocols for dismantling and safely handling radioactive materials, but those systems struggled to keep pace with the ever-growing number of submarines. The result was a growing backlog of aging, potentially dangerous vessels. With the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, this problem went from difficult to overwhelming. Suddenly, Russia faced the impossible task of managing hundreds of outdated nuclear submarines on a severely limited budget. Years of economic hardship and political chaos meant few resources were available for proper decommissioning or contamination control. The remnants of the sprawling Cold War fleet began accumulating in bays, piers, and abandoned shipyards, morphing into what would become the infamous nuclear submarine graveyards. This inheritance was never a part of the plan. The fleet was a symbol of the Soviet Union's power and technological prowess, yet the inability to dismantle these war machines without risk turned out to be a national crisis that was not spoken of. The shipyard workers who made this transition say that there were always shortages of basic materials and personnel, which made them take risks and store things for long periods of time in unfit conditions. Decrepit submarines, still radioactive reactors, and the neglected consequences were all adding up. Environmentalists, along with some scientists and experts, began to sound the alarms by the mid-1990s. Reports and pictures were showing decaying hulks stranded in shallow waters, some even with their reactor compartments quite exposed. The situation was already hard to imagine. More than 180 nuclear submarines were waiting to be dismantled, a lot of them still with spent fuel rods inside. This was a nightmarish scenario for any navy, but in the case of Russia's declining shipyard capacities, it turned into a disaster of national proportions. Even foreign countries did not ignore this. The potential leak of radioactive material into international waters increased the demand for intergovernmental cooperation and assistance. However, the progress was difficult and costly. The Cold War not only made the countries enemies, but also left a confused environmental legacy, with the public being unaware of the full cost for many years. To understand how this backlog remained, it is very important to know the intricacy and the danger that come along with decommissioning nuclear submarines. Safely retiring these ships is one of the most difficult nuclear challenges globally. It demands accuracy, machinery, and skills that are not available everywhere, particularly in times of economic crises. What makes this task so difficult will soon become clear as we explore the enormous hazards involved in dismantling a nuclear-powered submarine. The hazard of decommissioning. Decommissioning a nuclear submarine is neither quick nor straightforward. It's one of the most complex demolition operations on the planet. Inside these vessels are nuclear reactors containing highly radioactive fuel, shielded by thick steel and concrete. Removing this fuel safely requires specialized dry docks, heavy machinery, and extremely careful handling to avoid contamination or accident. The risk of exposure is always significant when dealing with spent nuclear materials. Under the Soviet Union, a system existed to handle this process, but it was never designed for the scale and speed that the old war demanded. Submarines were often retired faster than workers could remove their fuel rods and dismantle radioactive components. This created a backlog where aging subs, sometimes still containing fuel, were left in temporary holding areas. Most of these places were not prepared for long-term storage of radioactive waste, exponentially increasing safety risks over time. After the Soviet collapse, the situation worsened dramatically. Russia's economy was in free fall, and funding for the Navy and decommissioning programs dried up. Shipyards and facilities that dismantled submarines faced staff shortages and lacked the equipment necessary for safe defueling. Many subs remained tied up in shallow bays or abandoned piers with hole-cut hulls, but their radioactive cores were still inside. This extended storage outside of secure facilities created a hazardous patchwork across the country's coastline. Ships stripped of valuable equipment, but with reactors intact, became virtually radioactive skeletons floating in the water. Occasionally, reactor compartments were cut out and stacked in open-air storage yards, a cruel compromise that prevented immediate disaster but posed serious environmental problems long-term. Saltwater exposure corroded these massive steel sections, and ongoing monitoring was required to track potential leaks. Unfortunately, routine inspections were often inconsistent or underfunded. From the workers' perspective, the challenges were immense. Removing fuel rods is delicate work, requiring precise calibration with radioactive materials that can remain deadly for thousands of years. Any error risks releasing contamination or triggering a nuclear incident. In some cases, submarines were moored for years awaiting defueling or dismantling, increasing deterioration. Unknown to many, these ghost ships kept a quiet but persistent nuclear threat just miles offshore. This backlog and neglect caught the attention of international observers in the late 1990s. Environmental groups documented the decaying subs and exposed cases of submarine reactors or radioactive components being dumped at sea, an alarming violation of environmental safety. The combination of secrecy, limited national resources, and the vast scale of nuclear hardware waiting to be dismantled made the problem one of global concern. Efforts to address the situation included international programs supplying Russia with funding and technical support for submarine dismantling. These efforts have managed to defuel dozens of vessels and safely seal reactor compartments. Yet even with this aid, progress has been slow because of the sheer number of submarines and enormous costs involved. Decommissioning a single submarine can take more than a year, making the backlog a multi-decade challenge. This long delay in safely retiring Russia's nuclear fleet left the Vladivostok submarine cemetery and similar sites holding many subs with radioactive materials still aboard. It is here that the danger is most concentrated and becomes impossible to ignore. The question of what lies inside these rusting hulks and the risks they pose is what continues to haunt experts today. What happened next wasn't just about old submarines returning to the sea, it was about the consequences of nuclear accidents and contamination outbreaks that set grim precedents for what unchecked risks can produce. The decaying fleet tells a silent story, but the deadly lessons come into sharp focus when we consider the accidents hidden in the shadows of this history. The 1985 Chajma Bay nuclear accident. Hidden within the shadows of the Soviet naval program is a disaster that exposed just how fragile and dangerous nuclear submarine operations can become. In August of 1985, at a naval facility called Chajma Bay near Vladivostok, a routine refueling operation went horribly wrong. Technicians were replacing fuel rods in the reactor compartment of a nuclear-powered submarine, an inherently risky task known even then to be extremely delicate. But on that day, a catastrophic chain of mistakes and equipment failures sparked a steam explosion so violent it shattered the facility and changed everything. The explosion lifted the 20-ton reactor lid like a cannonball, sending radioactive debris flying and releasing a deadly plume of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Immediate casualties were heartbreakingly severe. 10 naval personnel lost their lives on the spot, with dozens more suffering serious injuries. Witnesses later recalled a terrifying scene: radioactive steam clouds drifting over the area and fire raging uncontrollably for hours, spreading contamination across docks and nearby land. For decades, news of the incident was suppressed under a heavy cloak of secrecy. The Soviet government enforced a strict lockdown on the site, sealed off by armed security, while families of the victims were left in the dark about the true scale of the disaster. Official records remained classified, and the extent of radioactive contamination was only revealed after the fall of the Soviet Union. When finally exposed, the hidden realities shocked experts and the public alike. Radiation surveys showed that radioactive isotopes, including cesium and strontium, settled extensively over the soil and water around the bay. Some parts of the seabed remained contaminated far beyond safe levels. Hundreds of buildings and vital equipment were poisoned by radioactive fallout, and the land itself bore a toxic scar. Importantly, experts warn that even decades later, traces of this radioactive residue persist in Chajma Bay, a stubborn reminder of the disaster's lasting footprint. The mishap brought to the surface the weaknesses that nuclear submarine technology has in its very nature, mainly when maintenance or refueling is done quickly or under pressure. It showed how a minor blunder in such a sensitive situation could lead to the death of multitudes. The explosion, to a certain extent, revealed the hazards that the Soviet Navy had deliberately walked around or could not cope with fully. It gave a startling example showing that the nuclear reactors on submarines were not the strongest and safest, but the opposite, even though the situation was completely controlled. The underwater graveyard close to Vladivostok, where submarines are buried, attracts researchers who constantly think about the past of Chajma Bay as a sad, but still very much present reminder. The disaster of 1985 is alert that even decommissioned submarines with nuclear reactors can be unpredictable in their danger. The improper handling of nuclear fuel or reactor parts, be it at the time of refueling or dismantling, may still lead to radioactive contamination, accidents, or leaks. The repercussions of that mishap are still present in our environment and history. The so-called downloaded contamination and its stay do not concern only the workers and the vicinity of the place. The radioactive contamination gone through a process of decay doesn't just happen overnight. It penetrates the ground, springs in the water, and lives on through aquatic organisms for centuries, thus endangering the survival of whole ecosystems and human health living far away from the accident site. Consequently, Chajma Bay's fate is an example of nuclear contamination, which, like the disaster itself, spreads from its epicenter and takes over entire regions. The present-day crisis of Vladivostok's submarine graveyard can be viewed as a direct continuation of what started at Chajma Bay. The same type of nuclear threat, leaking radiation, weakening hulls, and unresolved fuel issues, still exists in the dozens of nuclear submarines now rusting in the bay, the very issue that exploded catastrophically decades ago. The Chajma Bay incident revealed what happens when nuclear submarines are left to decay or are handled poorly. The shadow cast by this accident looms large over Russia's nuclear fleet, especially as economic collapse made proper handling impossible for years. Post-Soviet collapse and the crisis backlog. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did more than redraw world maps. It plunged Russia into economic chaos that endangered the safety of its vast nuclear submarine fleet. Overnight, the new Russian Federation inherited hundreds of aging nuclear-powered vessels, many still loaded with spent fuel. Over 180 submarines required dismantling, but the task was monumental. With the economy in freefall, funding for defueling and decommissioning vanished. Shipyards lacked materials, equipment, and personnel. Some facilities barely kept active submarines operational, leaving retired ones to rust at anchor. Reactors and fuel remained inside, their hulls deteriorating as years passed. What began as a technical challenge became an environmental emergency. Many submarines were partially cut apart but never finished, while others were stripped of useful parts and abandoned. These radioactive hulks floated in bays or were hauled into open-air yards, far from secure conditions. Each idle vessel became a ticking time bomb, its corroding reactor a silent threat to workers, nearby communities, and the surrounding sea. Safely removing nuclear fuel rods demands specialized dry docks, cranes, and containment systems. In the turbulent 1990s, such infrastructure was scarce, and defueling often fell behind or was skipped entirely. As a result, a patchwork of half-dismantled submarines lined Russia's coastlines, many still carrying hazardous materials. The financial crisis turned safety into improvisation. The Navy could barely function, let alone manage an expensive cleanup. Insiders later described haunting scenes: submarines with gaping hulls, leaking compartments, and no clear plan for disposal. Russia's nuclear legacy had transformed into a growing environmental and political burden. As conditions worsened, environmental groups and investigative journalists exposed the extent of neglect. Photos revealed decaying conning towers and reactor compartments exposed to the elements. Some reports even suggested that damaged reactor sections had been dumped in remote Arctic bays, spreading radioactive contamination into international waters. Global concern quickly mounted. By the late 1990s, foreign governments stepped in. The United States and several European nations provided funding and technical support to help Russia defuel its most dangerous submarines. These international programs successfully dismantled dozens of vessels and secured multiple reactor compartments, preventing potential leaks. But history took a darker path, and its consequences are still unraveling beneath the waters near Vladivostok. International aid and partial solutions. By the late 1990s, the crisis of Russia's aging nuclear submarine fleet had drawn global attention. Mounting fears of radioactive leaks and environmental catastrophe prompted international cooperation. Nations, including the United States, provided funding and technical expertise to help Russia dismantle its most hazardous submarines and secure unstable reactor compartments. This foreign aid was essential during a time when Russia's economy was in collapse. Joint programs helped remove spent nuclear fuel rods, seal reactor sections, and transport radioactive materials to long-term storage sites. Dozens of submarines were successfully defueled, rare victories in an otherwise daunting cleanup effort. Even with assistance, however, the scale of the problem remained overwhelming. Decommissioning a single nuclear submarine is an intricate process that can take over a year, requiring precision equipment and strict safety procedures. Hundreds of vessels still awaited dismantling, far exceeding available resources. The backlog was simply too large for short-term aid to erase. One more obstacle was storage. The huge reactor compartments, after being disassembled, had to be put in a secure place. Russia established large open-air yards for that purpose, where they would stay, and the radioactive steel blocks would be stacked side by side. This action lowered the chance of reactors going down in the ocean, but brought along new perils. The steel structures were subjected to weather, corrosion, and temperature fluctuation, and they started to lose their strength. Maintenance and monitoring became a part of the process to be done regularly to avoid leaks. The environmentalists pictured that the outdoor facilities were just a temporary solution at best. Open-air sites do not protect the environment from radiation at all, unlike underground repositories, which are designed for isolation. Rain and frost gradually penetrate the protective coatings, which then cause long-term contamination risks. The storage yards represented the situation of being contained but not resolved, safe for now, but fragile against the time factor. While the various international programs have been engaged, the advancement has been slow and inconsistent still. Besides, political tensions and changing priorities have frequently interfered with the cooperation. The funding was inconsistent yearly, and the very limited nuclear waste management infrastructure of Russia could not support the process. The delay in adding time to the corrosion of submarines left more reactors posing the same environmental threat. What was initially an emergency aid later turned into an unfinished challenge of several decades. Nevertheless, the international cooperation had a major role in bringing transparency to the entire situation that was once kept in the dark. The technologies used and the oversight provided enabled the experts to spot the most hazardous ships and thus decide on their dismantling as the priority. The entire activity not only increased the world's understanding of the nuclear legacy issue in Russia and its impact on the environment surrounding the country, but also brought the risks to the latter ecosystems to a larger audience. Before understanding the true magnitude of the danger, it's necessary to confront the grim discoveries made by experts mapping the site in detail. What was once merely a graveyard revealed itself as a living nuclear hazard. The submarine graveyard's true danger. The abandoned Soviet submarine graveyard near Vladivostok, once dismissed as a relic of the Cold War, now stands as a chilling warning from the nuclear age. Recent surveys confirmed what locals long suspected. Dozens of rusting submarine hulls still hold entire reactor compartments, and several still contain spent nuclear fuel. The assumption that all submarines were safely defueled before being scrapped was dangerously wrong. Corrosion, saltwater, and decades of neglect have severely weakened these steel giants. Reactor compartments, once sealed tight, are now deteriorating under constant exposure to the sea. Experts describe the site as a living hazard, where the risk of radioactive leaks increases each year. What was once thought to be a forgotten scrapyard is, in reality, one of the world's most unstable nuclear storage zones. The danger extends far beyond Vladivostok. Across Russia's vast coastline, other abandoned sites contain improperly stored or even secretly dumped reactor compartments, some still housing damaged fuel rods. Together, they form a patchwork of nuclear risk stretching thousands of miles. Vladivostok's site is simply the most alarming due to its proximity to populated areas and busy fishing waters. Adding to the crisis, many of these submarines were never properly recorded. Decades of secrecy and bureaucratic disarray left gaps in official inventories. Recent mapping projects uncovered lost vessels, their locations and nuclear status unknown until now. For nuclear safety experts, the discovery of untracked reactors is deeply unsettling. One missing compartment alone poses catastrophic potential. The stakes are not abstract. The bay near Vladivostok supports local fisheries and shipping routes. Sediment tests have already detected radioactive isotopes, confirming contamination has begun. If reactor casings rupture further, radiation could spread into seafood supplies and coastal ecosystems, endangering both livelihoods and public health. Unlike secure land facilities, these reactors rest in shallow seawater, vulnerable to storms, shifting tides, and temperature swings that accelerate corrosion. A single collapse could release a surge of radioactive particles into the ocean, a disaster impossible to contain once it begins. Nature itself, through weather and erosion, is dismantling these reactors faster than humans can act. For scientists studying the site, the findings are sobering. The submarine graveyard, once dismissed as folklore, has become an active nuclear threat. Its decaying reactors represent not only a local danger, but a global warning about the long-term costs of neglecting nuclear waste. The question remains, can the world unite to clean up this toxic legacy before it triggers a crisis that no one can contain? The depth of this nuclear hazard extends far beyond metal and rust, environmental threats, and future uncertainty. The corroding submarine graveyard near Vladivostok is more than a Cold War relic. It's a looming environmental hazard. Rusting hulls and decaying reactors threaten to release radioactive materials into surrounding waters, endangering marine life and nearby communities. Sediment samples already show traces of radioactive isotopes, hinting that contamination has begun. For local fishermen, the danger is personal. Radiation could enter the food chain through seafood, posing long-term health risks that are still poorly understood. Once radioactive elements seep into the ecosystem, they spread invisibly through plankton, fish, and predators, altering fragile marine balances. Ocean currents may carry these particles far beyond the original site, making it nearly impossible to define or contain the pollution's reach. This uncertainty frustrates scientists and complicates international response efforts, as each year of inaction deepens ecological damage. Harsh environmental conditions amplify the threat. Storms, shifting tides, and seasonal temperature swings speed up metal corrosion, gradually weakening submarine hulls and reactor casings. Underwater, there is no stable containment, only the relentless assault of salt, pressure, and time. A sudden collapse or slow leakage could release radiation without warning, leaving little chance for mitigation. Further complicating the problem, not all reactors have been officially recorded. Missing documentation, remnants of Soviet secrecy, and post-collapse disarray means some radioactive sites may remain uncharted. These blind spots hinder inspections and make it nearly impossible to assess total risk. Even the best scientists are working in the dark, uncertain of where the greatest dangers lie. International cooperation once offered hope. Programs in the early 2000s brought funding and expertise to dismantle some reactors safely. But rising geopolitical tensions and budget strains have stalled progress. Without renewed collaboration, the immense cleanup effort required will remain unfinished, leaving the environment vulnerable to worsening leaks. Governments face a stark dilemma: how to prioritize nuclear cleanup amid competing crises and limited resources. Yet the potential for irreversible contamination demands urgent attention. Protecting both people and ecosystems requires transparency, innovation, and sustained political will, qualities that often falter in the face of economic pressures. Monitoring continues, though resources are scarce. Inspections, radiation testing, and repair missions are difficult in such remote, hazardous conditions. Each year of delay compounds the environmental debt. For coastal communities near Vladivostok, the danger is silent but ever-present. Their livelihoods depend on the same waters that may be turning toxic. The haunting legacy of the Soviet nuclear submarine graveyard reminds us that building massive arsenals is only half the battle. Retiring them safely is a far tougher challenge, with consequences that ripple across generations. If you found this eye-opening, please like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into hidden dangers and astonishing discoveries. Watch the next video shown on the screen to uncover more untold truths and fascinating histories waiting beneath the surface.